Evening, everyone. Microphone's working at the back. Got it. Rattle your jewellery if you can't hear. Ken Clarke needs no introduction. I saw, reading about you, that both your father and your son are called Kenneth.
Yes, I think I had to put up with it, so I inflicted the same thing on my son, really. Yes, he doesn't go around doing an American thing, calling himself Kenneth Clarke III or anything of that kind. He tries to deny any connection with me in the outside world to avoid being pestered about my latest
It's really difficult for politicians' children, unless they're going into
politics.
politics.
Well, both mine, fortunately, with the odd moments excursion, have completely avoided the public eye. They succeeded in doing that. It is a damn nuisance, yeah. And I think both of them, when they first went to work, preferred their workmates not to know that they were anything to do with me. I think most of their friends all know now, but it is difficult because they're regarded nowadays, particularly in recent years, more than when I started when they were small, they're regarded as fair game by some sections of the media.
Were you ever known as Kenneth?
No, I still sign myself as Kenneth. I regard it as, when you get...
You still do?
I do, that's habit. When you're starting in politics, you feel a little self-important and you try to sort of, Kenneth sounds better. And nobody ever called me Kenneth in my life. Just a few odd people did. Now, everybody's always called me Ken, and I regard myself as Ken.
Okay. Now, you grew up, not everybody knows this, in a Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire border, Pitt Village, D.H. Lawrence country.
That's right.
Your father was a mines electrician, small businessman, watchmaker. I suspect from what I read, bloody-minded and independent and contrarian like yourself. But he was the man with ambition for you.
Well, I think he had, and I was very lucky with the fact that my parents were, happy to be aspirant for me and delighted that I was doing quite well. No, it's a place called Langley Mill. It's under the shadow of Eastwood. D.H. Lawrence came from the top of the hill next door. I spent the first 10 years of my life there only. That's where I first went to school and everything. It was surrounded by pits. It was just a pit village. And Eastwood was where my father changed from being in the pit and came out and started opening shops. He had shops in Eastwood. He always had a shop in Eastwood. So the D.H. Lawrence thing was quite close. My old man knew older men than himself who had known D.H. Lawrence. Sons and Lovers, which is a great book, they all said what a marvellous guy D.H. Lawrence's father was, and what a stuck-up pair his wife and this lad were, and they were all ashamed of D.H. Lawrence. He'd gone away and written these mucky books and brought to complete disgrace on the town, which was the view my school took in Nottingham when I got there later, if you're going to go through the lot. But D.H. Lawrence country, a curious mixture of countryside and mining. And I left it after 10 years.
Yeah, Dennis Skinner says mining communities are odd because they're actually in the countryside and people don't understand
particularly in the Derbyshire, or Notts Derby coalfield.
But it's always dangerous to ask somebody a question which you have no idea of the answer. I have no sense that you read novels, do you?
No.
Okay,
I used to. I was studying at school. I read no fiction. I narrow my mind when I read. I read a lot. It's all history and biography, not normally of my contemporaries, but historic politicians.
Okay. Nottingham High School, was that a direct ground school as older?
No, it had a funny history. He decided not to become direct ground. It was an independent school. I was
So you were a scholarship boy, like
I was an 11-plus boy.
Ed Balls was at the same school.
Well, I always make a joke saying he's typical New Labour. He was fee-paying. I went there earlier, and about half the entry were 11-plus in those days. The council still, you sat a kind of, by that time I was in a school in Bulwell in North Nottingham, and you sat the 11-plus. And if you got through the 11-plus, there was a kind of second 11-plus, which a couple of us were put into by ambitious teachers to see if you could get to Nottingham High School, which was a kind of, regarded as a kind of, starred alternative. And you had to go and be interviewed and things. And I got into Nottingham High School, which of course provides cabinet ministers since I've been there. We compete with Eton in the cabinet. We're down to one again now. Ed Davy's been left on his own since I left, but Jeff Hoon, and Ed Balls and all these people.
Now, so I'm fast forwarding here. We've got a lot of territory to get through. you go to Cambridge, you decide to read history, law, not history, because it's a fast track to politics.
Being
You're
utilitarian, yes.
Political, yeah, utilitarian is a word that's going to come up a lot tonight. Not a theoretician. You want to be a politician. You're not like William Hague because you're interested in other things, but from an early age, you want to be a politician.
Yeah, I just was...
But you're not sure which party.
I decided that at Cambridge, which was going to have the privilege of having me in its membership. For some reason,
your grandfather was a
primary
communist.
school. I'm not going about Langley Mill again, because we'll never get away from here.
Okay.
But I told a class, we called them in front of the class they were on to be in Langley Mill Boys' School. There was an all-age boys' school I went to in the village. I startled everybody by saying I wanted to be an MP, because I kind of followed it in the newspaper. Once I'd read Fluke at the back of my father's Daily Mail, I followed the affairs of the Attlee government. And by the time I got to university, I had slightly more understanding what it was about. And I read law, because I had an old-fashioned idea you could combine it with politics easily, which I did combine. It wasn't easy anymore. It was a rather 1930s idea I got. And I joined all the political parties, and after about 18 months, I was getting pretty conservative. I was a follower of MacLeod, Butler, all those people. It was the Macmillan government attracted a whole lot of people in Cambridge through the Cambridge Mafia later in politics.
Yeah,
Politics.
a good feed line for me. There's a picture which some people in the audience will have seen of your wedding day. There's another one of the Cambridge Union and another one of the Conservative. And you look at the pictures and say, oh my God, that's Norman Fowler, that's Ken Clarke, the thin one, that's John Gummer, that's Norman Lamont, Leon Britton.
Yeah,
there are
there's a picture of us all
5
together.
or 6 cabinet ministers of your
Six cabinet ministers were contemporaries. Others, I mean, some I didn't know well. I think Peter Lilly was there at the same time. He was
and David
college
Frost,
secretary.
whatever became
David Frost was the same college as me. He was a nightclub performer when I was there, preparing to go to showbiz. It was whilst we were still the privileged 10% of the population, probably less, who went to university, we knew that we were going to get some of the glittering prizes of life. Someone was going to have the privilege of employing us. And we were all very professional. So you have professional rugby players, professional cricketers, professional entertainment people, and you have professional politicians. And I used to mug up the law tripos in the Easter vacation and go and get through that. And I was very political. I got very active in student politics in Cambridge and nationally. By the end, when I left, I was a Conservative. I did a postgraduate year. By the time I left, I'd done all the standard things you do if you're trying to be a politician, the union and QCA and all that. And I was looking for a constituency to fight in the election.
And he fought Mansfield down the road in 64 and 66 and won Rushcliffe in 70. How far is Rushcliffe away from where you were born? Not far. It's still your seat,
no, not far. It's not actually my...
It's roughly your seat now.
And there were two. There are Nottinghamshire seats. I thought I'm defiantly provincial and suburban nowadays, and I just was Nottinghamshire. There aren't many MPs who really are quite as boringly homegrown as I am. It's my county, and Mansfield's the mining town in the north where I fought a couple of times against Labour in long strongholds, and then where Martin Redmayne lost Rushcliffe, I went and beat a Labour MP who'd got a tiny and indefensible majority. I've represented ever since, and it's probably about 2 miles from where I was born and about 3-4 miles from where I used to live when I was a boy.
Now, where I was leading this was to say, those pictures of you all in your white tie and tails, young men on the make, some people look at the photograph and say that's elitist, and I say, actually, it's meritocratic. They're all smart grammar school boys on the go. But my question is, when you went into politics, the Etonians had given way first to Ted Heath, working class boy, Margaret Thatcher, John Major from Brixton, then Hague, who comes from even further north of the Piccadilly line than you do, and so on, Duncan Smith. And now the Etonians are back in charge. What went wrong?
Well, you and I obviously have quite a lot of things have the same hang-up. Prejudices. We had a brief interval of meritocracy in this country. It was post-war England. And Margaret Thatcher's cabinet was all 11-plus boys. And we've got a few of them still around, actually. I agree. William qualifies. We don't know, and it's faded. What went wrong, I'm not in favour of going back to the old 11-plus, because it had terrible weaknesses and it was a terrible lottery as to whether you got through at 11 or not. But the reaction to it had a disastrous effect. And if I lived in where I wound up when I was 11, in Bulwell in Nottingham, I would have attended the local school a few hundred yards away, which got closed down recently because of inadequacies. And there aren't many. University entrance from Graham Allen's constituency, which is where it is the lowest in the country. I mean, it's not going to produce chances of the Exchequer for a long time, and unless we actually do try to get back some social mobility in this country.
Okay, we all follow you, but how you're saying Ken Clarke would not be sitting here, former everything, had he gone to school under
Probably
the present
not.
regime? Yeah.
I mean,
so what do you do?
the old Labour movement, when you had very, very bright people in the Labour movement like Nye Bevan, who ran a horse and cart, but actually would have been a brilliant university student because he got the mind for it, you could rise to the Labour movement.
Yeah.
But that stopped after the war. The Labour movement's the same sort of crowd of people as the Conservative Party socially now, the younger ones. And so it does education reform, all kinds of things. And we've just got to readdress the question of social mobility, which Alan Milburn's meant to be advising on. We've got ministers for it. And it's a combination of academic selection that is done more sensibly and actually looking at the career paths into professions which were made more difficult by the status-conscious changes which all the professions insisted on. They're all got to be all graduate professions. You've got to go away for training courses where you can't get paid. You've got to wind up in enormous debt before you can get into these little closed worlds, which everybody dominated again by collection of public school boys, really.
But you're an iconoclast. It's not a trade union or a profession you haven't beaten up when the opportunity has arisen over the years. What do you do about the dreadful, dispiriting situation you've just described, where it doesn't work?
Well, we are trying to do that. One of the points of the education, highly contentious, but I think Michael Gove and George Osborne are the two successful departmental ministers in this government. And Michael is actually very wedded to the idea of social mobility. So you start with education reform, and then you've got to look, it goes in parallel with the attempt to actually achieve full equality for women. You've got to look at the pattern and nature of the training and the entry into professions, and that has not been addressed so well. The professional associations, the trade unions, are quite resistant to making changes which would make it easier. And when I got called to the bar, for example, I didn't have to go and live in Guildford for 12 months. I borrowed a postal course, which Michael Howard had used, spent a fortnight studying this, went off and read the bar final. I didn't have to provide employment for a lot of lecturers. And when I went into pupillage, I learned on the job. I mean, I did my first case in the Court of Appeal. I was still in pupillage.
You're
not allowed. I mean, that was wrong. I shouldn't be allowed to do that.
But
you still, you don't have to go back to all that. That sounds primitive. Would deeply shock the people who now safeguard standards in these areas. But a lot of the standard setting, the all graduate professions, all this kind of thing, is actually over status conscious professional trade unions demanding all this entry.
You mentioned women a second ago in passing. Now, I know you've got form because you opposed women in the Cambridge Union in about 1959.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that was because the people pressing it wanted a real students' union, by which they meant the sort that holds dancers and gets some girls in. Yeah. And I wanted to keep the debating society, and the people pressing for the admission of women were against all this boring old debating society political stuff and wanted a union like other wild 1960s unions had got, where there was some proper social life. So it wasn't quite as simple. Okay. I was probably more reactionary then, but it wasn't pure reaction that resisted women. The debate was actually about, because we were called the Cambridge Union Society, and it was actually a debating society, should it be changed to something that ran some decent discos and got some women in? I was on the side, I'm afraid, being earnestly political, of remaining a political debating society.
Would you have ever contemplated all women shortlists for
getting if all else fails? I still think we may have to do it. The Conservative Party is taking a painfully long time to get the balance right. And it's the women who oppose the all-women shortlist, but the women who
Are you
got
sure
in...
about that?
Well, not so much, perhaps. You see, on the Labour side, they use all-women shortlists the argument that the ones who got in that way are somehow second-class citizens, they're kind of protected MPs, well, that's not true, because actually nobody can remember which of them got in on all-party women shortlists. So unless we really speed up the number of women coming in, I personally would advocate all women shortlists, yes.
Okay, well. It's difficult to pin you down in some ways because you relish being curmudgeonly in all sorts of areas. You are anti certain things. You're anti-trade union and always have been. Is that right?
Yeah, the reactionary side of and the protectionist side of trade unionism, and
but you don't
trade unionism is often a deeply reactionary force. It's against changing.
But solidarity is an
who
attractive
does what
thing.
And how they do it.
An attractive thing for working men who only have their labour to sell.
That was true at the time when they were trudging to the factories to be exploited in Victorian England. It was a defence of restrictive practices.
More recently than that.
By the time we got into the 1960s, 1970s.
Was
and it
there
was also an attempt to exercise disproportionate power on the part of certain powerful interest groups, and I'm rather against that of all kinds. And I include the professions. I mean, I include the BMA and the NUT and all these, because as George Bernard Shaw saying most of the professions are an organised conspiracy against the public, had a germ of truth in it.
What did you ever do to the Bar Council, of which you are?
I wanted the Bar. I used to complain the Bar Council wasn't a good enough trade union, but it's quite good. And
But what did you do to it? Margaret Thatcher
I did a bit of legal aid reform recently, which didn't have them thrilled.
Lord Mackay, to work them over. She was more effective in a sense than...
Yeah, well, I wasn't in... The only time I've ever been directly face-to-face with the Bar was at the Justice Department, when I was Lord Chancellor, Secretary of State for Justice. I was vehemently in favour of the rule of law, the independence of judges, the fact the executive is as subordinate to the rule of law as everybody else is in a free country and all the rest of it. So the principles of the law I upheld, but I didn't always please them. I think in particular the changes I made to the availability of civil legal aid and the way I stopped what I saw as a vast industry extending, huge numbers of lawyers we have now, into areas of activity where there was too much litigation and repetitive litigation. I took them on.
Example?
Well, family law was the most difficult and contentious. I'm glad to say I never practiced family law. I was a criminal lawyer.
But the family law judges are up in arms against
they
you
are.
because
it's harder
they say
work
we have unrepresented litigants, they can't do it, it's not fair.
They were saying me that at the time, yes, but we have in this country this adversarial system of litigation. You know, strong barristers kick bits off the other side, cross-examine and try to destroy the other witnesses and all the rest of it, as a way of resolving delicate, difficult family disputes. I mean, the 1 in 10 people who, when their relationships break down, unfortunately they now hate each other. Sometimes the worst case is they're using the children as a form of revenge on the other partner.
Yeah.
People who are civilized, nice people in every aspect of their lives become utterly unreasonable about the money and the children and everything when they break up. I'm not sure that endless litigation in the family court, usually with one side with legal aid and the other spending thousands of pounds on a lawyer to oppose it, I don't think that works. Now, that, of course, is a parody of some family law cases, and the family judges have the impossible job of sorting these things out. But if you remember, I was trying mediation, all that sort of other things, and trying to stop people thinking the answer to their post-breakup problems was to go out and find the toughest, nastiest lawyer they could find to beat up the husband and get him paid out of legal aid. Anyway, so I did what wasn't, because I am a proud member of the profession, didn't stop me. I had quite a civilized relationship with them. And other things, I kept trying to persuade them to reform the bar. It has to reform its relationship with solicitors and things. Chris has gone charging into the criminal law, but most members of the bar are a bit prone still to say the way it was run 50 years ago is absolutely marvellous. I'm in favour of a divided profession, but I tried to minimise the rows I had with them by saying to them, for heaven's sake, produce your own answers to my problem, that we have the most expensive legal aid system in the world, and you know and I know there are about 10 times as many barristers as there were when I practiced. Everything takes longer than it ever used to take when I was in court. And you know, we need to reform. We can't afford this remorseless growth of lawyers and litigation in the country.
You mentioned Chris Grayling there, so I'll mention him. He's not a lawyer. He knows probably less about the law than I do, which isn't much. And he's a bit of a bull in the china shop. Is that the right way to go about?
I never job back into departments I've just left as far as my successor is concerned.
Okay. That's a disappointing...
He has a slightly different approach to me, I would agree. The criminal...
Let's settle for that.
The criminal law legal aid reforms were in the drawer when I arrived. The officials got them out and saying, we've got to do this, Minister, and they'd prepared it for the last lot, my Labour predecessor, and I did think, I could see we were having a bit of trouble here, so I decided to go for not just family law, civil law availability of legal aid instead.
You were having fast-tracked through transport, employment, trade, the health department twice.
Much reshuffle career.
Education, yeah. The sort of John Reed of your day.
Well, he did it quicker because Tony had a reshuffle about every 6 months, didn't he? 9 months.
He did. The coalition has cured that by accident because it's not so easy.
No, the coalition, I think David was very good in not having a reshuffle for quite a long time, and I think he shouldn't slip back into having too many of them. You need at least 2 years to do anything in a job.
We'll
you
come
need
to
4 to have an agenda and deliver it.
We'll come to your terminal reshuffle in a moment. You went to the Home Office in '92.
Briefly, yes.
Yeah. And you were there for only 10 months before you went to the Treasury. But you had the Sheehy report. Reform of the police.
What I did in the departments, which the two where I really enjoyed most were health, because I had 2 to go to that, and then as Chancellor of the Exchequer. They were my 2 long stints. What I like is to have my own agenda of what I want to do, which I formed on advice, discussion, and all the rest of it, and know what I want to decide what I'm going to do, and then be allowed to see it through and deliver it. Now, I think John Major thought, I was going to do Parliament as Home Secretary. And I was fond of referring to the police service as the last great unreformed public service in this country, Victorian public service. You know, it's constructed like an army with ranks of officers and all the rest of it, and run a bit like an army. And they used to have chief constables who were ex-army officers, so they stopped doing that. And it hadn't been changed. So I was embarking on a programme of police reform. That was my main central interest. Unfortunately, Norman Lamont went under a political boss. And so, to my surprise, I found suddenly I got a transfer over to the Treasury and it never went through, and Michael Howard dropped it all. Actually, Theresa has done the most considerable reform of the police. You know, she's nothing like as right-wing as people think she is, and she's much more radical than people guess she is. And the police service, to be fair, have not offered the resistance that I expected ACPO and the Chief of Police
You got
Federation
23,000 coppers in Wembley Stadium demonstrating.
Oh, all that, yes, and because they're they're well organised, and nobody had ever taken them on before. Theresa has actually made some very substantial improvements. In the chamber this afternoon, I heard Keith Vaz actually praising her for made some considerable differences to the organisation. Police commissioners are not yet an all-fired success, but actually, the accountability of the police service, the way the police service is run. She and I got 30% out of our 2 budgets when we were Justice and Home Secretary, and nobody had ever saved a penny in anything labelled law and order in this country in my entire political career. And actually, you can do that, and the police service is at least as strong, if not better, when you finished it, because it makes people think about where the money's going. Court service should be as well, and so are the others if you do it properly.
She's got a much smaller department than you had. When you were in the Home Office, you said somewhere it was the most slow-moving and reactionary department you'd ever dealt with.
They were very high quality, but it was very old-fashioned, and they didn't like changing anything, yes. It's been divided. The Home Office Justice Department should have been carved aside. And
is that good? Does that work?
Pretty pointless, I think. But my advice to David was don't start restructuring departments. Tony was very keen on changing departments and giving them silly names. And it seems a good idea when you start. You wait 6 months whilst everybody argues about who does what and what brass plaque they've got on the door. Nothing gets done. When it's all over, you can't quite remember what you were doing it for and what you were meant to be improving it for. So I said, if you want to reshuffle, it isn't ideal, but I said to David, if you wish to change it, I'd wait for a quiet period when you've damn all else to do, if I were you, because leave as it is and run as it is, and I'm sure it wasn't my advice, but he doesn't have a quiet time. Yeah. He's got quite a lot else to do, and so it might as well be allowed to run.
So you moved to the Treasury when Lamont gets fired. He's an old friend of yours from his wedding or your wedding, and he's done all the work and taken all the shit, and you're a lucky chancellor. You're on the upturn.
That's not the Guardian theory. That's the Eurosceptic theory. You're trying to explain away the fact that I don't think I did too badly as chancellor, actually.
No, but Norman had done the spade work.
Norman had done some good work, as far as he'd been allowed to. Yes, he had. I mean, Norman had got us into the fiscal crisis we were in, and Margaret had left us the recession that we were trying to get out of.
We've not mentioned her up to this point. We've been half an hour without mentioning her.
But he'd done some good things. Inflation targeting was Norman had got through. Yeah. But I think he had a lot. It's problem with Chancellor is the political pressure around in those days, which was all rather simplistic, and the Bank of England wasn't independent and all that. So, I mean, it's fine. The way Norman was going, I agree with, but plenty of chancellors tried to do good things. The difficulty was being allowed to stick to economic policies aimed at improving the economy without being buffeted by your colleagues who, all prime ministers think their chancellor must have lost his political judgment. He doesn't know what buys votes anymore, and why doesn't he do this and that and the other. And I did work on the principle, as I occasionally told John, with whom I remained a friend. We didn't have the relationship of our successors. but in times we went back to the office and kicked the waste paper basket and cursed each other to our officials, I'm sure. But I worked on the basis, well, he can't fire 2 chancellors of the Exchequer. You can fire 1, but it's beyond the maximum permitted dose for a prime minister to sack 2. And we were in enough trouble anyway on other fronts. So, to be fair, he advised, he warned, at times he grieved, but he let me get on with it. And I stuck to what was pretty orthodox economic policy. The difference was, unlike most previous chancellors, that's what I did. I did what I thought was going to pay off, and I didn't allow people to push me off him.
But you were stuck with a we'll cut taxes by the 1992 election, which Major won. You were stuck with a pledge to cut taxes, which you didn't want to do because you're orthodox.
Yeah, taxes should things that sometimes go up, sometimes go down. It depends on the economic state of the nation. I had the most appalling fiscal crisis, which needed to be tackled pretty quickly, and unfortunately it dominated. I'd rather have had a period of office where I didn't have to have a tough spending round every year, but I obviously had to. And I had to raise taxation, and I had to cut public spending and get rid of this fiscal deficit, which is a burden. And I had to run monetary policy, interest rate setting, which is about all it involved in those days, in a way that combined this with low inflation. And I needed to get the politics off my back. So I started producing the minutes of the monthly meetings. Norman had started the monthly meetings, but to stop people interfering, I published the minutes so that I could say, oh, you can't do that. The governor will complain. I can't turn up saying the Prime Minister's orders be to reduce interest rates to make the party conference go better and all this sort of thing, which is what used to happen in the 80s. I present economic arguments for the decisions I took. That was the difference.
You said during that period, you having taken over as Chancellor because we were kicked out of the exchange rate mechanism, Black Wednesday, for people who remember it, you said that the exchange rate mechanism had never been given a proper chance. People took it...
I don't think you said that. With hindsight, I don't think it was necessary.
I think you did say that, didn't you?
Well, if I did, I'm not sure what I meant by that.
Believe you me, you did.
I might have. What went wrong was when we joined the exchange rate mechanism, which wasn't really necessary to create the single currency, I don't think, because I did work as Chancellor on working out how the euro was going to work. But it was meant to be a discipline. We all proudly said it's to discipline everybody, Maastricht criteria, all this. And then we joined the exchange rate mechanism, and some of my colleagues made the same mistake they made on the continent. This is a free lunch, it's a guarantee. We were thrown out of the exchange rate mechanism because we were so spendthrift and we got into a fiscal crisis. You could not, you're supposed to defend your exchange rate and keep within the little fluctuations. We'd spent money like it was no tomorrow at a time we were in a recession, and it was because of that the currency was indefensible. And the reaction of some of my colleagues, I won't name them at this early stage so soon after the events, was rather similar to today. Why don't the Germans put their interest rates up, and why don't the Germans pay us something to avoid this catastrophe? The Germans, not surprisingly, very wisely, did not take to that suggestion very well. But we left the exchange rate mechanism for the same reason that the Greeks damn nearly left the euro, because we mismanaged fiscal policy and we got a mounting deficit by spendthrift, which Norman hadn't really wanted to do, but he wasn't as in strong a position as me. He'd been bullied into doing.
But you said a moment ago, after John Major got the opt-out from joining the euro, the Maastricht opt-outs, you helped, as Chancellor, design the euro for other people, in effect, because we weren't
for us as well. We only would opt out if we wanted.
Yeah, but we weren't.
I was in favour of the euro. I still am.
Well, you still are. That's what I was leading you to. Have you never repented that rash commitment?
What I repented is that nobody's followed the rules. I spent some years.
You knew they wouldn't follow. The Germans and the French wouldn't follow the rules. They'd bully the Irish.
Of course, it won't get me to concede I made many mistakes. Old men don't when they start reminiscing. We should have taken more notice of the Germans, the governor of the Bundesbank, Tietmeyer, who wanted all kinds of penalties for not following the rules. I said sovereign countries.
He wanted people fined, and you were against it.
Well, I was against that, because I said, you can't go back to Britain and say we're going to be fined for not doing these things. But we had perfectly strict fiscal... I mean, the Maastricht criteria...
For people who don't know, it was no deficit above 3%.
And stock of debt no more than 6% of GDP.
And what's it going to be next year? It's going to be 80%.
This is a vision. Modern politicians, it's a mountain they can't climb. I mean, imagine Gordon Brown trying to keep to that. It would be utterly impossible, you know. We don't understand how to buy votes, all the finance ministers
He kept to your promised limits for 3 years.
Yeah, he hated it. But they were so worried about their economic credibility that in the 97 election, where actually they were going to bury us anyway, they were so worried about losing on economic credibility because we were miles ahead in the polls on the subject of the economy. And so they got around that by saying they weren't going to change anything. They were going to follow my policy. I kept pressing them and saying there's a black hole in their plans and all this in the election. No, there wasn't a black hole. I said, will you stick to my figures? Yes. Will you stick to the figures on levels of tax? Yes. Now, you'll raise higher rates of taxation? No, we won't. And for 3 years, to be very sensible of them, they stuck to their electoral commitment. They gave us no opportunity to say they'd broken it. The day it was over, they raced each other to the television to see which Tony or Gordon could announce first a massive increase in spending on public services, which they started. From then on, for Gordon, it was Christmas. He kept most of it off the books, but on the books, he spent as much as he possibly could.
We won't go down the PFI road today. Yet Brown never gets enough credit for keeping us out of the Eurozone, which probably most of the people in the room
in the Eurozone, we could at least have had a rescue. Being in the Eurozone, we got into the trouble for the same reasons. And we got into trouble because of this other reason. So the whole thing wasn't caused by the euro. I mean, the problem's now on the euro. The problem is the level of indebtedness of nation states and the state of the banking industry. And it started... the British are obsessed with the damn euro. The thing started with a credit boom and a credit crunch. It was all caused in Wall Street and the City of London. It was the folly of bankers, the complete uselessness of the regulators in the United States and here, including our own glorious Financial Services Authority, which wouldn't have dared speak to Fred the Shell about his risk management, and the weakness of politicians. And that's what caused the crash. Now, in the euro, fortunately for Greece and Portugal, because they kept the rules, should never have been let in. But anyway, there they were.
But they were let in.
I know, that's why they broke every rule. They let the Italians in.
And the Italians were let in. Geoffrey Howe said it was going to be impossible. He told me they won't be let in, Michael.
I still knew the finance minister. Said, what the hell have you let the Italians in for? They're nowhere near the criteria we set down for entry. And I got given a lot of stuff about, Imperial Rome, the birthplace of European civilization.
Yeah.
Amongst the first 6 members, of course we got to have the Italians. And that was the start of the rot. We letting the Greeks in on fiddled figures, letting the Portuguese in. It was a disaster.
And yet
it was the Germans who were the first ones to break all the fiscal rules.
Yes, that's right.
And
Their
start
own
running
bloody
up and down.
rules, yes.
Well, the Greeks didn't need much encouragement. None of them went in for it on quite the scale the British did. We went in for it we made the Greeks look abstinent, and we went absolutely mad, which is why we're in such a serious financial crisis. Now, in theory, we'd have been bailed out if we were in the euro, helped to bail out our banks and things. I think we're so big. The Greeks and the Portuguese and the Irish nearly broke the back of the whole thing. But, we're too big. We would have bust it.
Well, I think so too, but your lack of repentance ought to surprise me, but I've known you long enough to know that you don't repent.
We're lucky in a way we didn't go in because it wasn't run properly. I think the finance ministers of my generation can say if only they'd done what we spent all those years haggling amongst ourselves and negotiating, we wouldn't be in the present crisis. We wouldn't still be in a crisis now if everybody had kept to the Maastricht criteria. Who the hell would be bothered if we'd never gone above a 3% deficit?
Was it the
if
French
we only
or the
had a 60% stock of debt? We wouldn't have a crisis any longer because we're getting on top of what really caused the whole thing in the first place, which was the failure to control banking and financial services, the credit boom, followed by a credit crunch. But we all thought when the credit boom was on, only Vince Cable and I, like a couple of old men, carried on moaning about it. Everybody else thought there was free money now for your mortgage, to increase your public spending, to increase the staff numbers in your public services, and it all didn't matter anymore. I had people tell me it's all different now. They didn't talk about the new paradigm, but they said this time it's different when I went on about the slight recklessness, it seemed to me, of all this.
The most dangerous 4 words in economics. This time it's different.
This time it's different. Sell, make for the exit, get out. Once some pimply youth tells you this time is different, now is the time to save your money while you can.
But you were also
run for the hills.
You were also in favour of the European Constitution. You even claim to have read it. It's a horrible document.
Maastricht, yeah.
No, not Maastricht. The Constitution in 2006. You were in favour.
Yes, which became Lisbon. Yes.
Yeah,
well, it was all rather grandly a constitution. Yeah, Lisbon was quite good. Lisbon's very good.
Okay.
Maastricht and Lisbon were 2 excellent treaties, building on the treaties that had gone before. And all this about what you've read and so on, the actual document produced by a negotiation is like the order paper of the House of Commons. Page 4, line 20, delete and, insert if, and lots of that. Nobody reads that. Nobody's read that. But what you get is the consolidated treaties. You have to get what the latest consolidation of the treaties is, which most people, when debating into the House of Commons, don't have. I used to carry one around in my pocket when I was Chancellor because it came up quite a bit in ECOFIN and
there's probably an app now you could have it on. I wasn't going to ask about
Nobody seems to bother what's actually in the treaties. I do attend debates in the House of Commons, and the knowledge of the treaties there remains extremely low.
Indeed.
And it's absolutely nil in the wider world.
But the mistake you admit to making was agreeing to a referendum which is hanging around the neck of your party to this day.
Yeah. Michael Heseltine and only did that. We were both held out for ages. John Major was being given, a terrible time. He had an awful way he was treated by his party and the media and everything else as Prime Minister. And Michael and I had just blocked this referendum idea. And we both gave way almost at the same time. We didn't discuss with each other. And it was because, he was a friend of ours. And he got convinced that this was going to be Deus Ex Machina, going to save everything and we could put it all to a referendum. And in my opinion, it was the worst political mistake either Michael.
But you were saved by the French no.
When
the French said no to the Constitution, you were off the hook.
Well, we renegotiated it as the Lisbon Treaty.
Yeah. But David Cameron's put you back on the hook with consequences which are very, very hard to
Well,
predict.
you're getting into more dangerous ground now. I mean,
Well, enough of this memory lane stuff.
I normally answer that question by saying, you know, it's a generation. I accept I've lost the argument on referendums. I mean, every politician of my generation regarded the idea of running a modern, sophisticated country by referendums as ridiculous. You know, it was all right for Mussolini, but he had problems of his own. But it's the idea that such complicated, multifaceted questions should be answered by an organised yes, no answer to a simple question. I mean, Scotland, whichever way the Scottish referendum had voted, there were enormously difficult constitutional questions to answer. Hugely complicated task of actually creating an independent Scotland. Hugely complicated task of deciding where devolution now goes if they vote no. And most of the people campaigning hadn't a clue what the answer was, clearly, to any of those questions. The Scottish people debated them in an amazing way. There were very intelligent debates I found going on with people who knew what they were talking about in town hall meetings in Scotland. But there's still a lot of work to do. They create uncertainty. And of course, the Scottish referendum, like the European referendum that I fought when Harold called one, not settle anything. It actually unsettles the situation and opens up a lot of uncertainty
in
for time to come. So I'm not a fan of referendums.
In 1975,
if I may be cautious and discreet in what I say, I will go as far as that.
Okay. In 1975, when Wilson had an in-out referendum, you thought this won't solve anything. You thought 50 years, 40 years, whatever it is later, we'll still be banging on about this.
I was against it. Yeah. I had a great row with some of my Eurosceptic constituents about whether, because you're meant to be told what you believe by the referendum. So I remember a row broke out about whether I would vote to leave the European Union if we lost the referendum. So I said, no, I'm not a member of Parliament. I'm not going to vote to leave the European Union. One of my great causes since I've been in Parliament is to be a member of the European Union. And I remember having a row about that. It was Harold called. They're always called to try to quieten life. Harold called.
Party life.
Party management in the Labour Party was the only reason Harold caused.
And in the Conservative Party now. That's not disputed.
The Scottish one was to settle the sort of Scottish debate. And they're always called in the belief that it'll quieten down all this internal debate and everybody would now shut up and we can do something else. And a referendum. Harold was horrified to find that his colleagues in cabinet were going out and campaigning. He had no intention of campaigning. He tried to stop them all. But of course, within an hour, Roy Jenkins had gone one way, Michael Foot and Barbara Castle had gone the other, and he hadn't quite explained to them that they were all meant to shut up about Europe now and let the sort of, I don't know, some system decide in this referendum.
Put the question another way. Do you think David Cameron and George Osborne have heard of Harold Wilson or heard of the 1975 referendum?
Well, it's only on occasions like this where a couple of old veterans like you and I are allowed to indulge in all this. It's a highly specialist interest.
Because it's happening again, isn't it? They appease and then they appease the unappeasable.
And that didn't settle anything. The person who really believed in referendums, I mean, he genuinely did, and he wanted a referendum, and he believed in this more direct democracy, was Tony Benn.
Yeah.
And Tony Benn, who was the one genuine, sincere, impassioned advocate of the referendum on Europe. He lost it. Within 6 months, he was demanding we left the European Union. He took no notice of the result.
Yep.
And of course, what always happens is what the Scots will do if we're not careful. They invent a conspiracy theory.
Yep.
Oh, the public did vote against us, but they were deceived. They were told it was only an economic thing. It was a complete travesty of the truth. We've been arguing, it was always a political thing from the word go, and we've been arguing the politics for about 3 years. And that, had they known there was any politics in it, they wouldn't have voted. And I'm sure the Scots are busily working already saying, the English have deceived us by promising us devolution. Whatever we give the Scots, some Scot nats are going to try to say, it was all a trick, treachery, another referendum, we must have another one because that one doesn't count. And in fact, they're warming up already to demand another referendum in the next Parliament. And so it's not a perfect way, I do personally think, of either governing a country or managing these problems of party discipline. But people keep thinking it is, which is a pity.
Douglas Carswell is a Bennite, since you mentioned Mr. Benn, in that particular and in others.
I rate him as he's quite a sophisticated. I don't underrate Douglas. He's a sophisticated, intelligent guy without being patronising about him. I mean, just
You
is.
patronise away if you
Very
want.
able away. He's a very able man. Well, the left and the right, when you get to the hard left and the hard right, it is comic sometimes how suddenly they find that really for totally different ideological reasons they are agreeing. So I can't think of an instance where Douglas is guilty of that, but yeah, it's often
Referendums, he's a direct democracy man, same as
yeah,
Ben.
the hard left are direct democracy. So the other reason why, see, they know why they want a referendum. People in that sort of position, it's to get round parliamentary democracy. You demand a referendum on something where you know you're highly unlikely to get a parliament of professional politicians who will ever vote your way. And the newspapers like them, some of them, not of course The Guardian, but the newspapers like them because they can't fix a parliamentary majority. They fondly imagine they can fix the outcome of a referendum by their reporting and their campaigning. It's people who think they have no chance of a parliamentary majority who want referendums. They tend to be on the hard right and the hard left, because the British are unlikely to vote for a hard right or hard left majority of members of parliament.
It's widely assumed, and you're not going to confirm or deny, that you and Dominic Grieve, he certainly thinks so, were sacked because you're an obstacle in the way of, if necessary, reform stroke withdrawal from the European Convention on Human Rights and the introduction of a British Bill of Rights, about which you have well articulated doubts they would get a parliamentary majority for that.
Well, they're my views, but I share Dominic's views on it. I don't regard myself as I wasn't sacked. I was the oldest member of the government by a street. I was surprised.
Oh, there's Vince. Come on,
surprised ever to come back into government. I didn't expect after '97 I'd ever be a minister again. I was persuaded back in opposition. I had an agreement with David I'd do a couple of years. After, when he was obviously approaching his first reshuffle, I told my political aides they'd better go and look for another job, and the one with the family did go, because it was obvious I was going to go. I'd done me a couple of years. So I just assumed I was leaving at the last reshuffle. So with every other change in the last reshuffle, you can ask the political reasons for their going, but I really do think, it's not only that's my approach to it, but it was a perfectly amicable retirement, and then George Young went for the again, because we were, I was in my fourth government. I mean, fourth prime minister.
23 years. 23 years.
Yeah, I was in the Heath government, in the minor bag carrier in the Whip's office. So it was hardly surprising that in modern politics I was about the time I should retire, and actually, frankly. I can think I can cope better with just having one job, being a member of Parliament. So, and it's my age, that's not too surprising. I mean, I do find not having the red boxes at night is a pleasure. You know, it's sort of it was like normality that pour a large cigar, pour a large brandy, light a cigar, and settle down to the red box at about 11 o'clock at night. Now I still pour the brandy and I light the cigar, but I settle down to read The Guardian or The Times or see what they've been saying in the morning, you know. And it was so I retired from the government. Now Dominic's removal, that does surprise me, and I read the theory. I don't know, nobody's told me why Dominic was fired, but he's a friend of mine, and I tend to agree with him on all these things. And but in Dominic's case, it's a fair question. Why Dominic, an extremely able lawyer and politician, but I have sympathy with prime ministers. Reshuffles are impossible. I never know a reshuffle. No one can ever agree with every change you make in a reshuffle. It's a hateful job. You have to do it occasionally. You've got to promote some of your young ambitious. You've got to keep a bit of turnover. Every prime minister I've known hated reshuffles and dismissing people. and then everybody starts analysing your political motives for doing it. But in my case, that was probably the simple bit.
Okay, well,
At least Ken will retire. We agreed 2 years, he's done 4. And he's not averse to going. I wasn't averse to going. Off I went.
Your case for yourself is more persuasive than Grieve. To many
Well,
of us,
Grieve,
he was
there's
thrown
some
to the,
reason.
he was thrown to the wolves. A bit of red meat.
Grieve was sacked, as it were. Grieve was dropped. Those all described as sacked, but he was dropped from the government. And yes, so you can theorise as to why on earth was actually, he's one of life's natural attorneys, but he's a good politician as well. Why on earth was Dominic sacked? I'm biased, he's a friend of mine, I often agree with him, I agree with him on the European Convention of Human Rights. It is a good question, why was he dropped?
Okay. Now, we're going to stop in a minute and throw the event open to questions. This being a Guardian audience, I assume they will want to take you to task for your shortcomings on the civil liberties front, or your, what's the word, lively record on civil liberties. So
I'm rather good on civil liberties, I thought. Shami Chakrabarti has more time for me than most of my party. I think I sort of... I thought I should seek to defend myself with vigour, if you think I'm not very sound on civil liberties.
We'll look forward to that. But
Certainly.
I will wrap up mine by saying, they might even ask questions about immigration too. You were famously rejected 3 times as leader of the party. Roy Jenkins once said, I would have liked to have been Prime Minister, but I had a much happier life and a much happier later life not having so been. Do you regret not being leader of the party?
Oh, I'd have
Prime
liked
Minister?
to be Prime Minister. I mean, very few people go into politics, get into the House of Commons, they don't really think they quite like to be Prime Minister. And I always say it's the only bad habit I've ever given up, which is standing for the leadership of the Conservative Party. I kept indulging in it,
How did you let Ian Duncan Smith beat you?
Well, Ian Duncan Smith was Portillo's fault. The final should have been... The final should have been between Michael Portillo and myself. Very arrogantly, it seems to me we were the obvious only real candidate.
Yep.
Portillo or me. Michael was being persecuted quite unfairly, or all kinds of allegations about his private life years before, as far as I know, complete nonsense. But we're really getting him down.
You haven't seen him in those jackets on the railway trains,
well,
I can tell.
I haven't, no. But anyway, if Michael had got to the final, then the Conservative Party would have had to face the moral dilemma of its history, which is, was it more Europhobic than homophobic, or more homophobic than Europhobic? And I think I would have won. Whereupon this completely unknown guy, with a great respect to my friend and colleague now, Ian Duncan Smith, but no one had ever thought for one moment he was going to become leader of the party, this completely unknown character comes in and intrudes on the final. And a large part of our voluntary party were determined to vote for anybody whose name wasn't Portillo or Clark. So he swept in.
Okay, you don't get away with quite, because in '97 you were up against Hague. You created a Faustian bargain with John Redwood, who is not your kind of jazz fan.
It was to leave Europe as an open subject.
But you and Redwood,
we both keep off it. We agree. I was saying earlier on that Theresa May is nothing like as right-wing as she is regarded and perhaps likes to think likes to be accepted as. I'm nothing like as left-wing as people think. My views are those of the orthodox member of the Conservative Party till 10 years ago.
We know. But Redwood is right-wing.
But Redwood and I on economic policy invariably agree. We're both they both believe in market economics. We're both fairly orthodox believers in market economics.
I think it would be fair to say his eyes
there are plenty of subjects. I don't think he's averse to sort of public service reform and all the things that I was keen, because Margaret Thatcher was very keen on public service reform as well. She was a radical reformer of the public services. With hindsight, it would have been, both of us would have to have been self-denying, which neither of us are usually, and been saintly in keeping to the deal we'd done that Europe was going to be a non-subject so far as party policy is concerned. Neither he nor I were going to make speeches on Europe or engage in the European debate. It was an open question. Every member of the Conservative Party could follow their own path, which they'd all been doing for some years anyway, in the debate on the Maastricht Treaty, and we concentrate, rather as David Cameron later said, in going to get the party to stop banging on about Europe and to get on with tackling the Labour Party on the running of the public services and the economy and foreign policy and the things. You'd be amazed. All these most people's political position, as is perceived even by the informed public, is slightly a caricature of what they're really like. And John and I could have agreed on quite a lot of things in the governance of the country. It is true, all our friends would have said, don't mention the word Europe in the company of either of them, because they're all swearing off it.
My last question.
And it didn't work. And I finished William's career. If I'd beaten him in 1990, he'd finished it. Fortunately, he's been a very successful foreign secretary. But if I'd won in 1997, I'd have lost in 2001, because it wasn't possible to defeat Tony Blair in one parliament. William would have been a walkover in 2001 as leader of the Conservative Party. By 2005, the Blair magic was all over. And if only my party had opposed the Iraq War, which they should have done, we'd have beaten Tony Blair in 2005. William Hague would still be Prime Minister today, I should think. So I didn't do William...
Ed Miliband has made the same mistake,
I
hasn't he?
Yes, he probably has. I think he has. I don't think... They were so... Like us, they were annihilated in 2010. They were unelectable. The legacy that they carried with them, the legacy we carried after 1997 of that interminable Maastricht Civil War, the legacy of the financial crash which the Labour Party carried, it was the Labour Party doesn't seem to appreciate. It was a mountain to climb to get back into office after one parliament. But of course, MPs are dreadful. When they lose an election, instead of thinking, well, we certainly screwed that up, didn't we? They actually think, oh, the public have made a mistake. And by the time to get to next time, they'll realise they made a mistake, and we'll all be back, and we'll all be Secretary of State for this, that, and the other. If you remember, poor old William, I think it had it really upset him, I think. The party so loved civil wars, but it had a bit of a change. So we had 4 years of some daft argument between Haguites and Portuguesers, which he was presiding over while we were supposed to be trying to win an election. And he should have left me to do all that. Yep. And my political career would have ended a long time ago. And I say William, arguably, would have had a good long run as Prime Minister. And he would have been a very good Prime Minister, William Hague.
Have you said whether you're going to stand next time? And
Yep.
my last question, how's the next election going to work out? Is Farage going to finish your lot off?
Well, firstly, you were talking to the prospective parliamentary candidate for the Rushcliffe division of Nottinghamshire.
Okay.
I was adopted about 12 months ago. No, I'm going to go on after the next election. What I normally say when asked I'm always cautious about elections, but any pundit who claims to be able to predict the result of the next election is by definition an idiot. I've never known a more certain, anarchic, chaotic situation. At the moment, Farage is making the political weather. Whether that's going to continue for another 6 months, it is an honest reply. I don't know. Not surprisingly, I very much hope not. But if we are going to multi-party politics, and we're only following every other Western democracy, they're all in a pretty sick state. Normally it's extreme right-wing protest groups you have extreme left-wing ones. In Greece you've got Sinn Féin in the Irish Republic. We've all got this problem of a 20% hardline, angry protest vote. And we've all got the problem of about half the population not thinking they're going to vote for anybody at all, and probably declining to vote for anybody. I've never known a more uncertain situation, which is a good reason for carrying on, because it's a three-pipe problem and quite interesting. And I don't think this is a dull time in politics. Okay. It's a slightly alarming time in politics.
Okay, three-pipe
and
problem.
I look at the economy.
There's a microphone in the back. I can't see any, but I can see a hand waving there. Whoever you are, say who you are if it's relevant.
It is. Andrew Edwards. Ken, I just wanted to know, votes for prisoners. I get the impression that lots of Conservative members of Parliament get their knickers in a twist simply because they think the prison is going to take over the parish council or the district council, whereas votes for prison, it's going to be like you've been in the army. It's where you come from, not where you're sent.
Prisoners' votes?
Prisoners' votes. Well, I wish that, as I'm a defender of the Convention and the European Court, I'm not quite sure why the European Court got into all this. I'd rather they left it alone, because not that many prisoners would vote if they got given the vote, although until they raised it, and from anywhere but the European Court, we might have had a sensible debate. Before they raised it, if you'd asked the average member of the public, do prisoners get the vote in the United Kingdom, most people wouldn't have known. Some do, if you're on remand, you get the vote, but hardly any of them ever ask for it. If we ever were to do it, I wouldn't get too fussed if people were on short sentences for minor things. Otherwise, I do think prison is somewhere where you give up, there's a precisely give up your civic liberties and civic rights and so on, and it doesn't strike me as very sensible. But of course, the way it happened, coming out of the European Court, it's become a really impossible red-hot potato. Successive governments have not really resolved it at the court, I think. The European Court's got the wind up. It's having rows with other countries. It's backing off. Some countries have always given prisoners a vote. Germany, every prisoner has a vote. Nobody thinks it's an issue there. And we're all kind of hoping it will go away as an issue, really. And it's not one of my passion causes. I don't see any strong case for giving prisoners the vote, personally. Of course, the moment they're released, they all get the vote. You can be a mass murderer, but if you're out after 40 years, you can vote in the next election.
Harry Roberts. Right, woman at the front here with the mic. Where's the mic?
Diana Brighouse. Following on from your final comments, what are your views on votes at 16 and compulsory voting?
I'm against compulsory voting. I mean, compulsory voting means that if you really had a close run thing, it also, I mean, it doesn't work like this in Australia, I know. The Australians are trying to persuade me, but you could have an election really settled by your winos and people who have come out to avoid the fine. There are some people who refuse to vote and never vote, and you wouldn't particularly want them to, and you wouldn't have them having a decisive say. And I think the politicians should inspire people to vote. You should actually appeal to people. I think you should set out the convictions that you've got the courage to pronounce and try and attract people to them. So to have everybody voting because they get a 25 quid fine if they don't is no way of dealing with public apathy, I think.
Votes at 16?
And on votes at 16, I'm just my age. I'm against that. I was highly political, as I said. It wasn't primary school, so by the time I was 60, sixth form, I took part in the debating society and so on. I think I had a whole variety of views whilst I was in the sixth form. I went veering from right to left and all kinds of things. And I really don't think I had formed settled views, and I really do think, not normally this patronising as it were, but people just don't have formed views, and your experience is so limited. You must concede that all of us do go through some period of adolescence and maturing and acquiring a little worldly wisdom, and I think 16, 17 is a bit odd. I mean, the main problem is even the younger 18 plus, it's the young who don't vote. Yeah. Only a minority of first-time voters that we've got will vote in the next election unless one or other of the major parties get some message that actually inspires them to take an interest and come out and make a choice.
That's why they haven't taken away our bus passes, Ken. The man at the back.
My winter fuel allowance, I'm not going to do all that.
John Major, in his speech in Berlin last week, said that in order for Britain to remain in the European Union, he felt that freedom of movement would have to be limited to some degree. Is it possible to achieve that in negotiation?
Well, you better be careful. I'm going to be not being very careful on history, but I'm being more careful on contemporary things. I mean, I knew John was going to make the speech, and John's views are very like mine. And John was very worried about the way European vote was going. So I met him informally. We informally discussed it. I was delighted he was going to join in. I didn't entirely agree with this speech, and I'm not quite sure why he went down that. I agree with him about the consequences of leaving the European Union. I think it's with the triumph of Farage, because everybody's responded in the wrong way to Farage, is to conflate the immigration issue, a serious issue, with Europe. I mean, all politicians want a strong policy on immigration, and the public want them to have a strong policy on immigration. Farage's triumph started when strange body, Migration Watch, and UKIP started saying millions of Bulgarians were going to hit our shores on the 1st of January, has been to turn all this debate into something that somehow all comes from Brussels and is largely dominated by the free movement of labour. Of course, you can make some changes on the arrival of Europeans, although I think we should point out that many fewer come now than came a few years ago. It's not, and they overwhelmingly come here for jobs because they've got skills that sadly we still can't always provide, or they take jobs that sadly we can't always get English people to do, or both of which need to be addressed. But the free movement of labour, we've signed up for that for years, and just as I think a single market means properly, we've got to complete in the services, it's the free movement of goods, it's the free movement of services, free movement of labour, and that's irremovable. The rules already allowed us. It's our own negligence that didn't stop us years ago having tougher rules against people coming here just for benefit. The treaties were never intended for that. Very few do, but you should stop the ones that do that. They come here for health, with some their own government pays for that anyway. And I think it's a mistake, firstly, to attribute all the problems which are caused largely by economic catastrophe, combined with failures to build enough houses and failure to respond to an ageing population quickly enough, all of which the government is contending with and tackling, to suddenly attribute all that to being the fault of foreigners and immigration has led to a worsening in the political debate. And to make the people who want to blame foreigners and immigration associate that with the European Union is a mistake. The majority of immigration comes from outside the European Union.
Does it?
I think so. Does it still? We've got it down.
The
I mean,
polls-
what people are utterly unaware of is we have tightened up most
All
of these
those
things.
little-
And Theresa is not a soft touch. We've reduced the level of immigration to the country quite substantially. And the European immigration is going up again because we're going through this period of growth in the British economy, but it fell quite considerably. The big flood of Poles, which nobody objected to at the time, very forcefully, I think opposition voted against it in the House of Commons. I'm not sure why. But it didn't cause a fuss. It was 10 years ago. So my old friend John, who I was delighted when we discussed he was going to make a speech in Berlin. And I think he thinks he's being helpful by trying to see if he can get some concessions that will get us off the hook. But immigration should not be central to this reform thing. And the Eurosceptics, I understand why Eurosceptics bang on about European immigration. They're trying to get David to add to his menu for reform things which they know are incompatible with membership of the European Union, and he can't get them. Well, I understand that, then agree with that. We're all improving, and we're improving already, we can do it now, the way we handle European immigration. But next time I see John, I was asking quite, because it's all feeding the credibility of Farage.
Is that the mistake you made?
When mainstream politicians who are held in regard, instead of saying all this stuff about immigration is grossly overblown and it's not an easy escape from the serious problems we have with our economy and our public services and so on. If you all start saying how wise Mr. Farage was, how we must persuade everybody to let us tackle this problem, not surprisingly, angry, disappointed, protesting people go out and vote for Mr. Farage. And I think I would have hoped that John would have avoided that trap. I respected him to do so rather more than that. We should have talked about what he was going to say at Berlin.
So that was his mistake, that he fed the Farage narrative?
Well, I just do think that the heart of all this bizarre debate we're having is this idea that the principal answer on the issue of immigration, and the answer in immigration, is to have a tough system deciding exactly who comes here legally, and then getting the Home Office and the Borders Agency to work a sensible system that enforces that, which we had trouble in doing for years and which it collapsed 10 years ago, as everybody now appreciates. That's the problem. But if you start telling people, if you think there's a problem with immigration, the answer is it's all caused by Brussels, and we've got to sort out Brussels. Firstly, that's factually wrong. Most of these things are within our own control. the European rules are misrepresented, and you do great economic damage to all the member states. And what are you going to do about all the Brits made to come home who are working in Berlin and Paris and Rome and all this sort of thing? Who's going to decide which of the Romanian nurses we're recruiting should come and which of them should stay at Romania? I mean, the Home Office doesn't make a perfect job of running visas for non-EU people now. All these points systems, so that every European national who wants to come and work in our construction industry has now got to go through a points process, will produce chaos. And of the 400,000 Frenchmen in London, which of the hedge fund managers can stay and which have got to go back and all this sort of thing? We're giving it too much credibility. It's the background to this current by-election, I think. You've got to have the courage to challenge some of this. Of course, you're right to demand strong controls on immigration, but most of the problem is these blokes who get off a lorry, underneath a lorry when they get over from Calais, they're from somewhere in Africa. You don't know their name. You don't sure you quite believe what nationality they say you are, and you try deporting them back to where you say they come from. The Moroccan government will say, well, no, we don't think he is a Moroccan. You prove it. And by this time, he's moved halfway down the road, and he's now an Algerian with a different name. And that is the real problem that the Home Office and the Borders Agency face. And the idea is you've got to make Brussels give up freedom of movement of labour. Margaret Thatcher was an advocate of this. It was a British Conservative government that gave momentum to the single market. The Conservative Party and the Labour Party, successive British governments, have been advocates of the freedom of movement of goods, services, capital and labour, and it's one of the underpinning things of the greater prosperity that we're all trying to get back to.
But she did, after she signed that, she did exactly what you accused the Faragistas of doing. She said, I was robbed, they lied to me, Tony Blair. After signing that act,
I heard of that. When in her embittered old age, when her friends persuaded her that it was all Europe that had got her forward, she was pro-Europe. She ran a pro-European government. She had rows. Europe's constant scene of rows. I've had rows in plenty of councils and ministers. But that was in her later age, with rather embittered hindsight, unfortunately. I had lots of discussions with her about the single market, what we were going to include, what we weren't. The one thing about Margaret was every damn piece of paper you ever put into her, she read every word of it. And she was deeply, deeply immersed in the content of politics. And I'm afraid one of the sadder things that I never did believe Margaret when she started, after she persuaded herself, somehow she'd been misled. And she hadn't understood what she personally had been leading and steering through the European Council was, within my recollection, I have to say, total nonsense. Total nonsense. And it was one of the best things she did was to give the leadership which we were capable of giving to a European Union which was going through a good patch. We got Kohl and Mitterrand, Delors and people. But she was the one of that big four who wanted the single market, and it was intrinsic to the single market. And you're not going to get away from freedom of movement of labour because it'll cost everybody a lot of money, including the British. It won't damage the economy.
Questions?
Tighten up the rules.
Let's have the frontier and let's find a gender balance. That's what we want.
Thank you.
The one in the second row. Okay, you go first.
Thank you. The debate on Europe and immigration is not complete without looking at how many Brits are living in Europe. As you know,
it's about 2 million, eh?
Sorry?
It's about 2 million, a bit short of 2 million, eh?
Well, to my knowledge, the retired people in the coastas of Spain and Portugal and south of France are about 2 million, plus about 1.4 million working in the new Europe. So the total is more European countries are having Brits than the Brits having immigrants. And why can't we see these statistics? It must be available. Nobody ever mentioned it.
I do. I don't get reported in right-wing newspapers. They've given up people like me that don't report anything that doesn't fit with the views of the editor. But yes, we should make more of it. Because we live, the modern world is a globalized economy within which the single market is one of the freest, most developed, one of the most open. And so we don't have as many immigrants coming as some other countries. Norway, which isn't even in the European Union, but it's in the economic area, has a bigger number of EU workers in its population per head of Norwegian population than we do. Germany has far more asylum seekers from around the world than we do. And younger people realize if you go to a modern city in a thriving economy, you do hear foreign languages in the underground. A lot of them are tourists. A lot of them are students who we should attract. We're getting a reputation for being anti-foreigner and being hostile, and the number of students being attracted to our universities is dropping. Paris gets 10 times as many Chinese tourists as we do, because we're getting an international reputation for being all hooked on these things. Now, on the continent, because if you're, if you're working a reasonable good career in today's economy, you expect sometimes to have expatriate work. There are multinational companies, and there are lots of young English people working in Brussels, in Paris, in Germany. I think my Eurosceptic colleagues, they won't do anything about those. They're not foreigners, they're British. The Germans won't send them back. No, that's quite different. I mean, absolutely quite different. And their description of EU immigrants is, they're all people here on the dole. Well, it's ludicrous. They're far less inclined to claim the dole than the local British are. And we have to challenge some of these bizarre assumptions.
But when the Single European Act was signed, nobody envisaged the disparity between earning power within the European Union was much more homogenous before the former Soviet bloc countries came in. That's a fair point, isn't it? The people will come and make sandwiches in Northampton for 3 times the money, and the locals won't do it.
Well, the ones who didn't, I don't know what they were thinking about. I quite agree, that's one of the things, but we did anticipate that. Because in forming a single market, one of the things you had to do when enlargement was taking place, and that enlargement was the biggest success of the European Union in my lifetime, most significant change to take to the European Union, most significant political event of my lifetimes, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Thanks to the European Union, we have the whole continent was converted to democratic, liberal regimes running market economies. History of Central and Eastern Europe gave one no automatic belief you were going to get that. But also they were underdeveloped economically, hence a great deal of the budget of the European Union to get everybody into a single market was to help them with economic development, infrastructure spending, to steadily narrow this gap, which is happening. Which is why from some of the Eastern European countries, a lot of the polls have gone back, the flows are not what they were, and you've got to watch it in future. If you take in a very poor country, you do have to have some interim period. But the idea that we all start setting barriers and point systems and rationing the number of nationals who can come in. Now, if Europe wants to go backwards, it can happily do it, but it won't succeed, because in the modern world, the fact is, I didn't see a black face myself, apart from chaps coming up from the pit, till I was 8 years of age. I didn't meet a foreigner till I was about 10 or 11. Nowadays, that sort of young generation just know that a proportion of the people they meet, English isn't going to be their first language, or the father of their friends is not going to have English as his first language.
And that's true in
your
patch
work
too, is it?
You meet lots of people from different nationalities.
That's true in your constituency too, is it, as well as in North London?
The children of immigrants in my constituency, yes. The successful, mine's a fairly prosperous part of Nottingham, Nottinghamshire, it's just a suburban, rural villages around it, and the number of people from ethnic minorities is steadily growing. Okay. And yes, if quite a lot of Europeans come to work in Nottingham, and mine's a sort of area where the businessmen or the engineers or whatever will choose to live. Okay. And we got more immigrants, I should think, than Clacton, but we haven't got quite as many as they have.
Okay, there's a woman on the front being patient here.
By a long way we haven't.
Colleagues have produced these proposals, which appears to indicate that they feel that Parliament should be the last decider on any judgment that comes from, it seems to me, not only Strasbourg, but perhaps our own Supreme Court as well. Is this not an attack on the separation of powers and therefore the rule of law?
Well, we haven't got any detailed proposals yet, but if they took that form, I would agree with it. There are politicians of all parties and complexions in most countries who start getting all hoity-toity about unelected judges interfering with their wise decisions. And I think unelected judges, so long as they're only intervening not on any political basis, the American Supreme Court is a bad example. But just to, in defence of fundamental liberties and not striking down purely arbitrary, ill-thought-out decision-making, it's an essential protection of liberty in the modern world. And the Convention is important not only as an underpinning to that, but the other importance of the Convention, is going back to what I was saying about the nature of Europe now, it extends, to about 40 countries. And it's the one lever we have for actually trying to keep up pressure to maintain values in the rest of Europe. It is astonishing that Russia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Georgia, all subscribe to the Convention, all accept the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. They get vastly more claims than we do. We win 98 out of every 100. We only lose 2 in 100. And if the British turn around and say, well, of course, we're only going to comply if the whips can't get a parliamentary majority to strike it down, I tell you, they'd be keen on that in the Duma. They'd think that was a very good idea in Russia to stop all these judgments coming in and to let these great and wise parliamentarians they've got decide it all. And I think we've got to be very careful where we're going. But domestically, the idea that we sort of advertise in a peculiar way that the British can't comply with the European Convention on Human Rights will be a very sad day, it seems to me.
But it is true that Supreme Courts have a tendency, ours, the American, the European, to engage in mission creep.
Yes, if you pass some really daft legislation, they find some common law principle to strike it down, is the tradition in Britain. But actually, because the British work on the basis that our law, statute, normally British courts, will imply, if we do wonderful things with statutory interpretation. But actually, if the statute is drafted, which is very rare nowadays, so it's clear and unarguable, the British courts will feel bound to honour it, though the best judge-made law, you can usually find something to set aside, something you think you can't possibly have meant this, and you do your best to mitigate it, but I'm sure if you're a judge. But our Supreme Court, when it comes to the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, which gets criticised a lot here, the judges themselves in our courts will point out that they're only under a duty to have regard to the decisions of the European Court. It already is hedged about. I can't remember the name of the principle. We had a great reform of this in Brighton when I was Justice Secretary, when we had the presidency of the Council of Europe. I tried to publicise it. Couldn't get anybody interested because it was far too complicated. It was based on the reality of what happens in Strasbourg as opposed to what everybody said happens there. And it's not additionality.
It's not the margin of appreciation.
Yes, the margin. We agreed that the court was going to be instructed by the council to have more regard to the marginal allowances it has to make to allow for the different cultures, different legal systems in different countries. We weren't going to have some, like prisoner voting. I don't see why nobody's now trying to say you have a monolithic system across Europe. And there should be more of that. And they were also going to, the delay is the worst things of the European Court. Because all the right-wing press love to have these mad mullahs. It's much easier than arguing about tribal politics in Syria to play our problems are all caused by mad mullahs who we've got to deport. And we had some pretty nasty mad mullahs. And one thing none of our press actually reported was we won every case. We deported the lot. The European Court was not stopping us deporting Abu Hamza and all these places. Abu Hamza's, I think he's in custody, either had trial or awaiting trial in America. And it was astonishing that none of the newspapers announced our triumph. The problem with Abu Hamza was it took about 5 or 6 years to get there, thanks to procedural problems. And at Brighton, we agreed, and I hope the Council of Europe will keep pressure on its court, the European Court of Human Rights. The delays are inexcusable. There are a lot of fee-spinning lawyers who take rubbishy cases there about triviality, and they need a process which strikes them out pretty quickly, stops them cluttering up the system, deals with what the convention is meant to do, which is things that arise, fundamental questions of civil liberties, human rights, and the accountability of the executive of whatever country it is to the rule of law.
Last question. Pass the mic back a bit. There's somebody with white hair. Let's have an oldie question.
Thank you. Ian Mitchell.
When after you, Ian Mitchell, we'll have a bloody young person. Okay.
When is the strong argument for staying in the European Union going to be made, and who's going to take the lead in making it?
Right, that's an easy one. What's the second one? Do them as a job lot. The young person, are you the young person?
Well, it's relative.
Yes, okay. Well,
Isn't it the case that David Cameron's problem is not UKIP, but his own backbenchers? And isn't his greatest failure one of leadership in appeasing them at great potential cost to this country?
Well, on the second one, again, I kept trying to become leader of the Conservative Party, but British political parties are very wide coalitions. And no other country would all be in the same political party. So to take a safe example, Tony Blair and George Galloway were in the same political party for about 20 years. And throughout my political career, the leader of these great conglomerates always has a dreadful difficulty of party management. Actually, when it works, it's very good, because the fact that you have a purpose-made government covering a very wide spectrum of people who are agreed on a programme, a modicum of party discipline, are actually going to deliver, should produce, in a functioning democracy, a stronger system of government. Now, I don't think I'm being indiscreet to say that both John Major and David Cameron have found that party management has to be very high up the list of things they have to have regard to, and they have considerable difficulties. And we also have had the emergence of UKIP, which is it's just our version of what exists in every Western democracy. They've got the Tea Party in America, and we've got all these funny fringe groups across every other Western democracy, including the Scandinavian ones. The tactics of confronting them or keeping them under control, stopping them taking your voters, are a very lively subject of debate. I'm not one of those who thinks that you best, and may gather from what I said earlier, it's no good imitating UKIP, trying to sound like them. You make them more credible. You actually got to first perhaps might be a bit unpopular to challenge some of the nonsensical assertions upon which they're trying to arouse all this prejudice and fond imagination that there's some simple solution to the country's problems if only you start doing something about foreigners. And all that. And so that's more the problem. And it clouds what somebody asked, the first question, why are we in Europe in the first place? And it is true. We're so used to having a debate here, which is continually about what the latest problem is, and having every meeting of a council of ministers, which are perfectly amicable, reasonable negotiations between 28 friendly ministers, presented as if it's the gunfight at the OK Corral when they get back here and parliamentary and media debate starts, that nobody ever makes the basic case for. And, I entered politics believing Britain was kind of lost. And I was obsessed with the idea that the country needed to be modernised. Post-Suez, I was at school at Suez, but it affected the politics when I joined. We'd lost an empire, we still had the League of Empire Loyalists, we still sort of imagined we're there. We'd no idea what our role was, as Dean Acheson said. We needed a footing in the modern world to have an influence on events and to participate. We were an economic laughingstock. The countries we defeated in the war were outstripping us. We just needed to decide, where does Britain belong in the modern world so we can thrive? And the extraordinary advances of the United Kingdom in the last 40 years, when present state of Britain, the health of its society, the health of its economy, quality of its public services, are far higher than any of my contemporaries could reasonably have expected to live to see. And when I first started in politics, a lot of that is because we found our footing as members of the European Union. And in the interests of Britain in the future, if we want to be able to play a role in what is now a very dangerous world, look after our legitimate interests of our citizens, some of these great problems in Central Europe and the Middle East, and as well as farther afield, if we want to have one of the leading modern balanced economies with sustainable growth, the foundation for that is as one of the leading members of the European Union. Just like the Scots would have found themselves lost and diminished if they ever do go off and start creating an independent Scotland, we would be lost and diminished if we left the European Union and decided there was some sort of solitary, isolationist existence we could continue. No serious world leader would pick up the phone to the British Prime Minister if he was busy, if we were outside the European Union and trying to run our own foreign policy. Our economy, we wouldn't lose 3 million jobs. That's simplistic nonsense. What would happen is we would steadily find ourselves falling behind the more successful of our neighbours if we took ourselves outside the Union and the market. And make no mistake, UKIP would take us out of the Union and the single market, because if you're Norway and you've got the market but have no ability to have a say in the rules that govern the market, you still obey the rules. You have to seek to British ministers to find out what you think the rules are going to be. And you still pay a large contribution, pay quite a hefty contribution, the Norwegians, to the budget. And they have free movement of labour with a very high number of EU nationals working in Norway. They still have what UKIP present as the downside, because even the Norwegians need the upside of playing a part appropriate to their size in the modern world. We're a big country. We should be a leading player in Europe. The alternative is a dangerous illusion, I think, that you pull out and go back to the 1960s or whatever, when supposedly things were better. They sure as hell weren't. I can remember the 1960s.
Right. That is an elegant point on which to end. Thank you very much. I can't help asking, when hearing you talk as you've just done, knowing that the most formidable politician of the lifetime of most of us in this room was undoubtedly your old ally and adversary, Margaret Thatcher, who couldn't have said almost anything you've just said. You were the first cabinet minister to tell her to her face she ought to go in 1990. She says in her memoirs, in his usual brutalist way. What's her place in history going to be?
She was the best Prime Minister I've ever served for. I mean, she loved a great political row. And the myths that surround the Thatcher government, we could have another evening, you know, but we can spend the whole evening on it. The right wing in politics and the left wing in politics have each created ridiculous mythology about the Thatcher government, what actually happened. It reformed, it rescued us from the dire straits we were in the end of the 1970s, which wasn't a very good decade politically or economically. Again, helped create a modern state, got us back into the modern international economy. A whole lot of fundamental changes took place. Obsolete technologies were allowed to die, and services began to be reformed to put them on a modern, proper footing to cope with the demands upon them. And she loved a damn good political row. She never read a newspaper. Bernard used to tell her what he thought were bits that would cheer her up and leave the rest. She never bothered the rest. She had no time. She took no notice of opinion polls. We never had a popular policy. We were always behind in the polls. And every job I was given in the Thatcher government, my policies were miles behind in the polls, all the rest of it. I had terribly robust arguments with her. One day I'll tell you, she didn't want to do my health reforms, and then when I'd done them, she wanted to cancel them. They weren't the Thatcherite reforms at all. She wanted to make it an American-type insurance system. Yeah. But she would doggedly do it, and you were judged by the results and where you got to. And she just liked a damn good row, and so long as you had a sensible row, once you'd satisfied her, at least you'd done the work and had some clue what you were talking about. and we weren't going to do anything else anyway. She'd let you get on with it, I mean, I had great rows with her, and I was more pro-European than her, but she wasn't a hardline Eurosceptic. Everybody she put in the cabinet was very pro-European. She didn't agree with me on the ERM and the single currency. More importantly, she didn't agree with Geoffrey Howe and Nigel Lawson on that either. But she was pretty pro-European. Really. I remember her campaigning in the Harold Wilson's referendum with a T-shirt on with the flags of the member states on it. It was it's looking back on Margaret. The left have made her a dyed-in-the-wool arch-villain. You know, people would happily wearing their clogs, rattling over the cobbles into the mills if it hadn't been Margaret Thatcher closing them down. And on the right, they made her some fantastic heroine who was the ultra Baudelaire, an arch right-wing nationalist who would have saved us from all this stuff. They're rubbishy descriptions of Margaret Thatcher. It was a hell of a good government to be in if you could stand the hassle. And there's a lot of hassle, and it was hard going sometimes, but no, I look at it very fondly. It's extremely sad that she lost it at the end. She was an author of her own destruction, poll tax. She finally decided she'd got to do everything herself and all this, and she'd lost her touch a bit. And it was very sad, and she was persuaded to get quite embittered about it afterwards, and all these people surrounded her, and she spent her time campaigning against John Major. She suddenly became a zealot Eurosceptic. That's the latter-day Margaret, which was a bit of a sad postscript. That government, more than any other post-war government, the country was different at the end of the period of office to the way the country was at the beginning. Not many governments achieve that. Normally you can't notice the difference at all. That country had actually changed its role in the world, how it ran itself, where it was going. And on balance, and we got some things terribly wrong, but on balance, it was a damn good achievement. So my relationship with Thatcher are not at all what people expect them to be. It was a bloody good government. Because nowadays, it's all public relations dominated, if you're not careful, newspaper headlines, opinion polls. And if you're not careful, all your advisors start advising you not to make a difference because it'll upset people. Stop doing that.
That's a point at which to stop. We're stopping some good men playing. Thank you all for being an attentive audience. Thank you, Ken Clarke.